It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Alex Webb. Alex Webb is a photographer, a photojournalist. He began working in 1974. He joined the prestigious photo collective Magnum Photos, and I understand that you served as their president as well in the recent past. For the past 30 years, he's worked on a number of assignments, both editorial and personal, for the New York Times Magazine, Life, Geo Magazine, and National Geographic. One of the things that he is especially known for is his work in Mexico and the Caribbean, which he will be talking about today. Currently at the Museum of Art and through May 4th, we have an exhibition of his work under the title The Suffering of Light, 30 Years of Photographs. And he has a book by the same name, which is a wonderful book. However, the first edition is sold out, and you will have to wait for the reprint, which I understand is coming out a little bit later this year. He's been the recipient of numerous fellowship and awards, including a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, and he's also received the Davis Octavius Hill Award, amongst others. Please join me in welcoming Alex Webb to Brigham Young University.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Corey. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to show you three selections from three bodies of work today. Predominantly the body of work from the exhibition and the book, The Suffering of Light. But I'll also show a short audiovisual piece called Violet Isle, which is from a book and exhibition that my wife Rebecca Norris Webb and I did on Cuba. And at the very end, I'll show you just a sort of little teaser, a little sort of homemade video of a handmade dummy of a new book that's coming out next spring on, of all things, Rochester, New York, which I will talk about at that time. This quote up here comes from the introduction to my second book, Under a Grudging Sun, a book on Haiti, and I think it pretty much expresses, what I've been doing as a photographer for many years now. Most people know me as a color photographer, but I began as a black and white photographer. And so by way of an introduction to The Suffering of Light, I thought I would show you a few pictures in black and white, just to give you a sense of sort of my roots and where I come from, because I really see myself as coming very directly from a stream of black and white street photography. And I'm certainly as allied with that tradition as I am with any tradition of color photography. In 1975, I reached a kind of dead end in my photography. I'd been photographing the American social landscape, sort of big, empty supermarket parking lots and sort of unhappy-looking little people and dogs creeping by. And the pictures were kind of alienated, sometimes ironic, maybe a little funny. But somehow I felt the work was dead. It wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't resonating. It wasn't expanding. And I was casting about sort of what to do with my photography, and I happened to pick up a novel by Graham Greene, The Comedians, which is set in Haiti. And the book fascinated and also kind of scared me. And so I decided to go to Haiti. And I don't know whether the lights can go any lower or how it is seeing this. If it's okay, fine. But and that first trip to Haiti in 1975 really transformed me as a person and as a photographer. I saw a raw world, a tragic world, unlike anything I'd seen before, but also a world filled with a unique sense of vibrancy and life in the face of that kind of tragedy. And I came back from Haiti, and I realized I needed to work in these places that had some kind of resonance with that. I began to work also along the U.S.-Mexico border. This is West Texas, Mexican working illegally, cleaning swimming pools. But as I worked deeper into the U.S.-Mexico border, further south in Mexico, and also other places besides Haiti and the Caribbean, I began to realize that there was something missing, that I wasn't capturing something in black and white. I wasn't dealing with the searing light and the vibrant color that suffused these places places that in many ways, I realized seemed to almost have a sense of vibrant color embedded in the culture. And so as a result, in 78, 79, I began working in color. And this was a big step for me, because before that I'd really considered color to be something that was sort of crass and commercial, something that maybe one made a living from, but was not where the real heart of photography lay. So this brings us to this book, The Suffering of Light. The suffering of light comes from a quote from Goethe. It's part of his general theory of color, and the quote is, "Colors are the deeds and suffering of light." And I like the quote for this body of work because there's a sense of enigma to it. Suffering, light, and I think that running through this body of work, there's a deep sense of enigma. I think these pictures tend to be questioning more than anything else. They don't provide answers. And so this body of work really is my effort to come to grips with this obsession of working a certain way in certain kinds of places in color, as I've been doing for some 30 years. So we start on the US-Mexico border, 1979, an arrest in San Isidro, California. Also the US-Mexico border, Boquillas, Mexico. And this book and this exhibition is composed really from 8 previous books. One of the books being one on the US-Mexico border. But this picture, for instance, from Grenada in 1979, was first published in my first book, Hot Light, Half-Made Worlds, which was my first effort to sort of bring some coherency to this fascination that I had with working in the tropics in color. This is Grenada also. This is Haiti from 79, from my first trip to Haiti working in color. Uganda, 1980. The Dominican Republic. And there was something about these places. I mean, it wasn't just the color, but it was also this sense of life as lived on the stoop and in the street. I mean, I come from New England, a place of kind of gray-brown reticence, where things happen behind closed doors. And in these places I was working, like here in India, you feel that the theater of the street is out there in front of one. But this book is also organized chronologically, so throughout this period of time there were other things I was doing, and this is a picture from Dallas, Texas, from a series I did on urban Texas. And this is from Coney Island, not so far from where I live in Brooklyn. And this is back to the US-Mexico border from Isleta, Texas. Merida, Mexico, a very red circus tent. And Zaire, what is now the Congo. Barbados. Ciudad Madero, Mexico. I thought after my first book that the next book would be a book on Mexico. I found myself fascinated by a certain sense of Mexican culture, something about the particular mystery of Mexico, the world of children in Mexico. But it's a project that hasn't come together, and maybe it will. I mean, I'm just playing around still with the notion of a Mexico book. This is from Monterrey. Some of the pictures like this one begin to suggest something about modern Mexico. Others like this from Tehuantepec reflect another older Mexico. But what happened with the Mexico project also was that in '86, the 30-year regime of the Duvaliers came to an end. And I went back to Haiti for the first time in 6 years after the fall of Baby Doc and began photographing there. In my initial trips to Haiti, I think I was really very much working in the spirit of my first book, an ongoing photographic dialogue with the streets of Haiti. And the initial pictures that I took were, fairly timeless. They could have been taken over a number of years in Haitian history. These are school prayers in Bombardopolis, in the northwest part of Haiti. Bombardopolis was named that because when the slaves revolted in the early 1800s, the French bombarded the town. And this is the cover of the Haiti book. The book was called Under a Grudging Sun. But I I'd gone back to Haiti a few times, but I still wasn't sure about the Mexico project. So here, I returned to Mexico in '87 while I was still engrossed in the Haitian project. And I think that some of these later Mexico pictures from '87 actually are a little darker emotionally than some of my other Mexican work, a little less lyrical. And that may well reflect the fact that I was working so continuously in Haiti. And so now we're back in Haiti in 1987, summer of '87. And during that period of time, Haiti shifted and the project that I was working on shifted, in that Haiti descended into a kind of state of terror, where there were burning barricades set up in the street. And the project that I was working on, instead of being sort of this ongoing dialogue with the streets, became a much more of a kind of socio-political document for these 2 years of Haitian history. It's a memorial for people killed by the army. A man who was killed, his body rolled in mud and left in a doorway, as a warning to keep people from going to the polls. This is on the docks in Port-au-Prince. Cap-Haïtien. And so this book, unlike any of my other books, is organized chronologically. So as you saw, Mexico sort of comes and goes, and it will keep coming and going through this. Different projects have different arcs of completion. Some projects, like the Haiti book, took 2 years. My U.S.-Mexico border book, I wasn't ready to let go of for 26 years. So you'll continue to see Mexico border pictures pop up here throughout this. This is Sote d'Eau, sacred waterfall in the central plateau of Haiti. The Virgin Mary and the voodoo goddess of love, Erzuli, who are basically the same in the voodoo Catholic pantheon, are both supposed to inhabit this fall. It's a fertility. The pilgrimage that takes place there is a pilgrimage about fertility. And now we're going somewhere very different. We're going to Florida. This is Key West. During the time that I was photographing in Haiti, I often got stuck in the Miami airport. The airport in Port-au-Prince was closed down, and I had to wait. And I began looking at this very strange state called Florida. And I initially started photographing some of the new immigrant groups, but I rapidly realized I had to photograph the totality of Florida, from strange leisure parks to old age homes to, as in this instance, a brush fire outside Palm Beach. Florida's a strange state. It really seems to be a place where people all come with their own fantasies, whether they're fantasies about youth or sun or sex, or from the Caribbean and Latin America, fantasies about something or another about the American dream. And I think most people find something a little different than that which they initially were looking for. This is from Fort Pierce, Florida, a small convenience store in a depressed part of the city. And these are Guatemalan children in Indiantown, Florida, a town that has a large migrant population during the growing season, and almost all of them, at least when I was there, came from one province of Guatemala. Daytona Beach. Miami. Miami Beach, just before a storm. Now we're in Mexico again. I haven't let go of the Mexico project. So this is Oaxaca, from a trip I made in 1990. And now we're in Paraguay. I had an assignment to go to Paraguay for a period of time, and I found the place fascinating. Seemed like, in many ways, sort of out of time with the rest of Latin America, None of the large political movements that were sweeping the continent seemed to affect Paraguay. It seemed sort of caught out of time. It's a project that I ultimately ended up making a book dummy of. I've never tried very hard to get it published because I haven't thought that very many people were going to, or at least no publisher that I knew was going to jump on the idea of a Paraguay book. But it's a fascinating little country. A couple pictures from Puerto Rico. And some of these pictures, like this one, appear in another later book, which I'll talk about in a little while, a book called Dislocations. This picture in particular comes from the book Dislocations. Dislocations is a limited edition book. There were only 40 copies that I did that sort of explored the notion of dislocation, not just geographical dislocation, but psychological, emotional, cultural dislocation. From the US-Mexico border again, Tijuana. It's a model of the Mexico City Olympics on top of a building. And this is Barcelona. In '92, I spent a good deal of time in Spain, photographing in 3 cities, Barcelona, Madrid, and Sevilla. And some of these pictures, like these two, I did use in the book Dislocations. Barcelona again. Nicaragua, the Caribbean coast of Central America, a place that's always kind of intrigued me. It's kind of a world between the Caribbean and the highlands of Central America. Doesn't really feel very linked to the capitals of the country. Really looks more towards the Caribbean. And now we're in Brazil, in Tefé, from a project I did on the Amazon River. In '93, I was asked by National Geographic to do something on the Amazon River, and I was given tremendous freedom, and I basically went from the mouth to the source. This is from the same project from Palma Pampa, Peru. The military are there because of large amount of drug trafficking and also the presence of the guerrilla group Sendero Luminoso. The man carrying a mirror is a mirror vendor and is hoping to get on a plane to go back to Lima with a very clean mirror. The Boi Bumbá Festival in Brazil. I mean, particularly in the Brazilian Amazon, I really almost felt like I would stepped into the background of a Vargas Llosa or Garcia Marquez magic realist novel. People became animals, animals became people. This is a child dressed up as a paiche, a huge freshwater fish, and this is actually a parade for Earth Day in Iquitos, Peru. Mural in Tefé, Brazil. Looking over the back of the boat that I lived on for some 6 weeks while traveling up part of the Brazilian Amazon. And just outside of Manaus. Squatter houses on the outskirts of a floodplain. And now we're back in Haiti. '94, this is during the US invasion. These kids are being blown around by helicopter dust from US military helicopters that are landing in Gonaive. And now we're in Cuba in '93. The first trip I made to Cuba. I'm going to talk more about the Cuba project later. It's a project, as I mentioned before, that ultimately I did as a collaborative book with my wife, Rebecca Norris Webb. And this is the Amazon, also from '93. Cuba again. This is in Sancti Spiritus. This is the back of a baseball stadium at dusk, and so these people are watching a baseball game. It's actually a baseball game between some Cuban all-stars and a US team of all-stars. Unusual at that time. And now we're back on the border, Nuevo Laredo. Also the border, this is on the outskirts of Tijuana. I have no idea why these shoes are there. I asked some people and no one was able to tell me. Atlanta, from a project that I did for the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, sort of looking at Atlanta. and now Ethiopia. Istanbul from '98. Istanbul ultimately emerged as a major project in a book. This was the first trip I made in '98. It was actually, I'd been to Istanbul once before when I was 16, and I always kind of remembered it. And I had this assignment to go to Turkey, and I spent some time in Istanbul and realized I had to get back. Didn't have any money to do so. It had to wait a few years, but this is one of the first pictures I took on that trip in '98. This is also from that same trip, but from eastern Turkey, from Sanliurfa. And now Panama. Panama, just before the U.S. Passed the canal back to the Panamanian government. This is U.S. military jungle warfare training, and the ubiquitous third world dummy that they shoot at. This is also Panama, from Panama City, and a mural. I mean, there are times as a street photographer, there are things you find like this. They're sort of more fantastical than you can imagine, the idea of this vertical ladder that some kid's on in the midst of this mural of a volleyball game. Also Panama, Bocas del Toro on the Caribbean coast. And now we're back on the border from one of the last trips I made while completing the border book. And this picture really, I mean, the border sort of attracts just all kinds of stuff from both cultures. And this picture in some ways seems to me to have so much of the border in it. I mean, it's got Christ, it's got Santa Claus, it's got the Backstreet Boys, and it has a prostitute's legs. And this is also from the border from Tijuana. France, from a project that I did in Alsace-Lorraine. And now we're back in Haiti from the last trip I made to Haiti, which was in 2000. These are the salt flats on the outskirts of Gonaive. Cuba once more, Havana, 2000. And then back in Istanbul, 2001. 2001, I managed to find some funds to be able to go back and spend significant amounts of time in Istanbul. And this really propelled the project forward. There's a specific kind of melancholy that seems to suffuse the world of Istanbul. And you almost sort of feel it on people's faces. Also from Istanbul, I mean, for me, this particular picture sums up a lot of my feelings about Istanbul. It's such a complex, layered city, and this picture begins to suggest that. Also Istanbul. This is the cover of the Istanbul book. And September 11th, 2001. My wife and I happened to be in New York at that time. We live in Brooklyn, several miles from this spot, which is across the water from Manhattan. And we really weren't really aware of what was going on until well into the situation. I think that by the time that we heard about what was happening, the second tower had collapsed. There was no public transportation, so I went and rented a car, drove to the East River. The bridges, of course, were blocked off. You could only get in by foot. So, and we got out of the car after I parked it, and someone came out of a building in Brooklyn Heights and said, "Do you want to see what it looks like from the roof?" And this is one of the first pictures I took that day before crossing the bridge to go down to ground zero where the towers were. And this is from Cuba, 2001. Thessaloniki, Greece, or a project I did crossing the Aegean. And Mexico again. Here, Mexico comes back. I think this is 2004, Mexico City. Also Mexico, from Veracruz. And now we're back in Istanbul, a freighter on the side of the Bosporus, the body of water that divides Istanbul in two, and a kid swinging on one of the cables of this grounded freighter. Again, Istanbul. Istanbul again. Panama from 2006. The Dominican Republic, this was taken in one of these places called Bates, which are where Haitian migrant sugar workers live in terrible conditions while they harvest sugar in the Dominican Republic. And this is Mexico from Tennessee. This was a murder that took place Sunday afternoon in a bar. I happened to be walking by. And now we're back in Cuba in 2007. Cuba again, this is Barrio Chino, the Cuban section, the Chinese section of Havana. Havana again with hurricane tape across the windows. Azerbaijan from a project I did crossing the South Caucasus from eastern Turkey, across Georgia, down into Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, and ultimately into Azerbaijan. And this is from the same project. This is in Georgia. This is actually on a train. And the last picture in the book, this one from Erie, Pennsylvania, came from a trip that I made. It was a period of time when my wife was photographing in South Dakota, her home state, where we would drive our car from New York to South Dakota at the beginning of the summer and then leave it there for the summer for her to work, and I would fly back. But during that time, we sort of began meandering, especially through the Rust Belt of the United States. And I took this picture on that trip, and when I took it, I realized that this seemed to be the right picture to end this book. I didn't want to end the picture on that picture from Georgia on a train. I felt something that needed to be more uplifting. The other thing that I think is interesting about this picture is I often feel that the last picture in a book points to the next book or the next project. And this is from Erie, Pennsylvania, not far from Rochester, New York, which is the project that I'm going to show you at the very end here. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a little audiovisual presentation of Violet Isle, the book on Cuba. As I said before, I first visited Cuba in '93, and then in 2000, Rebecca, my wife, and I started going back regularly from 2000 through 2005, and then again in 2007 and 2008. The project started out as two utterly separate projects. I was photographing the streets of Cuba, and I was loosely going to call my body of work Esperando, because as many of you know, in Spanish, Esperando means both hoping and waiting, and there's this palpable sense, almost metaphysical sense of waiting and hoping in Cuba. It seems almost larger than just the notion of, the end of the U.S. embargo or the death of Castro. And Rebecca, who had discovered all these odd, quirky collections of animals all over the island, often in people's houses, where we'd go into a village and someone would go to a house and someone would pull out a boa constrictor and then a woodpecker and then a mountain hawk, and it seemed very strange. She was going to call her project Three Rooms, because she ran into a habanero who said, we have 3 rooms, one for my wife and me and 2 for our birds. And initially we thought, and then we suddenly came on this notion that we would combine the work just before our last and 11th trip to Cuba. And initially we thought we'd have these 2 chapters, 3 Rooms and Esperando. But after talking to an editor, the person suggested maybe we should combine the work because the work is very different. And so we started exploring this and interweaving the work, and we began to get very excited and realizing that somehow the relationship between our pictures expanded our portrait of Cuba. Our pictures talked to one another. And often when we think of putting together books, we use analogies with other arts, particularly music. And, so that would mean like a big book is a symphony, a small book is a sonata. Well, needless to say, this book, of course, is a duet, and it is set to a Cuban duet. And the last thing I'm going to show is just a very brief, little tiny video about this new book that Rebecca and I are working on called Memory City. Memory City is a photographic exploration of the streets of Rochester, New York, at this particular time when Kodak, which has been based there for 125 years, has declared bankruptcy. And so it's a project that, besides exploring the streets of Rochester, it also explores notions of memory, time, and film at a time when film, during a time which really may well be the last days of film as we know it. So I will quickly do this.
I love the tactile quality of working with film and contact sheets, even if I've never liked changing film in the rain, not to mention Rochester's late spring snows. Yet what I do like about working with film, unlike working digitally, is that something tangible is left behind, a piece of film that occupied the same place and time and perhaps bad weather as the photographer. Even if the film is nothing more than the flimsiest of materials, like those silk or taffeta or organza dresses at the back of a woman's closet, film has accompanied us to dance after dance, wedding after wedding, anniversary after anniversary, funeral after funeral, no matter the weather.
In Rochester in 2006, I took this photograph using Kodachrome, a film Kodak decided to discontinue 3 years later. It's hard to believe that the positive film that I used for more than 30 years can now only be processed as black and white, as I've done for this project, and not only comes out as negative, but produces an image that seems slightly distressed, almost weathered. Kodachrome, from rich, vibrant color to deep blacks and white, like a fading memory. So that's it. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them. I know some of you have classes to head off to very soon. So just one note about the Memory City project. We were working on it last week with our publisher in Santa Fe, and the dummy looks quite different now. There are at least 4 or 5 pictures that I just showed you that are no longer in it, and a whole bunch of new ones that are in it. So, just so you know. Any questions? Yeah.
With some of the places you go, like Cuba or something, where I feel like a lot happened recently, that's changed, but maybe
Mm-hmm.
has that made you want to go back and continue to explore the issues or add to what you've done?
No, that's a good question. Well, with regard to Haiti, I mean, clearly when the earthquake took place, I did certainly consider going back. I was in the midst of something else, however, and wasn't able to go back right away. And I did, also, as I thought about going back, realize that there were countless numbers of photographers already there. And I wasn't sure what I could do necessarily that was going to be anything very different. And there was also something else, which is that, I don't know whether I have much more to say about Haiti than the book that I did in, 86, 87. I don't know if I go back. I would do anything that would significantly add to that. There is something about doing a book that somehow does cut something off on some level. And when I've been back to Haiti, as I have been a few times since doing the book, I haven't gone back there with quite the same sense of passion or commitment, because I haven't sensed that there's something there that's going to come out of it. Besides a few random pictures and maybe something for a magazine that is published and then disappears a week later. So that is always an issue. I do feel that part of me has moved on from Haiti, and Haiti was an incredibly important place for me, one of the most important places for me as a photographer in my life, but it may well be that it's part of my past. And perhaps the same with the U.S.-Mexico border, I don't know. You're absolutely right that a lot has changed on the border. A lot has changed in Mexico. And I'm really trying to resolve myself what to do about that in relationship to my Mexico work, because I really feel that my work comes from an era before the, huge presence of, horrific violence, drug violence. And I don't know what to make of the relationship between pictures that deal with the kind of lyricism of Mexico and what has gone on in recent years. And so, part of me is thinking that maybe I need to do a book on Mexico now or soon and call it, for lack of a better title, Before the Zetas or something like that, before this transformation of the world of Mexico. But I don't know. But it's a good question. Yeah.
So you mentioned that your career began taking photographs in the United States, and then you went to places like the Caribbean and Mexico. Did you struggle going from a place that was relatively calm, maybe no one would have thought much of you taking a photograph in the United States, going to a street scene in an impoverished sector of Haiti or in Mexico? Did you struggle with any of that new tension as a photographer?
Well, the fact of the matter is that in many of these places, not necessarily Haiti, though parts of Haiti, but certainly in Mexico, there's a tremendous openness to photography. That in working in the streets of Mexico initially, I found people, sort of inviting me into their houses in a way that was certainly very different than when I sort of wandered around parts of the northeast of the United States. So, it's a complicated thing. There are places where, yes, it is difficult to work and there's tension, but at the same time you find that photography can sometimes be a kind of passport into people. See you with a camera, you're a foreigner, they're kind of intrigued, they invite you in. And certainly in places like Cuba and Turkey, this is very true. Hang out on the streets in Istanbul for a while and you're soon inside people's houses having tea, So, it was different. There's no doubt about it. It was different. But actually, I felt that there was at least in my early work in the United States, there was a kind of alienation and distance and a kind of critical look at my own society that upon entering Mexico, for example, I felt something much warmer, and the pictures themselves are much warmer and lyrical. And I'm trying to get back to some kind of sort of slight combination of that on some level in returning to the United States now. I feel that somehow, having been through these various places outside of the United States at this point in my life, I'm able to come back and do something different now, say in Rochester, New York, than what I would have done 40 years ago, which is when I was last working significantly in black and white. Yeah.
I'm really interested in how you go about this, but I love your photography because it seems to incorporate so many things in the frame, so many depths, just so much contrast. It's really fantastic. I picture you walking around, taking 2 steps, pausing for 10 minutes, taking 2 more steps, and pausing. Can you tell us about how you approach?
Well, I think every situation is different and varies. And there are situations where I walk into a situation and take a couple frames and walk away with a picture. And there are other situations where I sort of smell the possibility of picture and I wait a little bit and then I take some pictures and wait a little longer and take some more. And there are others where I walk in and I'm able to sort of start photographing immediately, and I go through, then 6 rolls of film. Now it would be digital. But so, I mean, every situation is different, but I try and approach as unobtrusively and quietly as possible. Obviously, I realize I'm not part of that world and I'm an outsider. But I also think that a lot of times, if you can approach people with a certain kind of sense of seriousness and that you're not threatening, that a lot of times people will let you hang out, and to a surprising extent. So I don't have a specific formula. It's just that, I work with whatever each situation will let me work with. But a lot of it is walking and waiting and walking and waiting. I mean, the pace of a slow walk seems to me to be really good for this kind of photography. You're moving and you get into a kind of state where you're sort of almost daydreaming. You're sort of musing on all kinds of things while you're looking around and responding.
I have a question about your experience with the various media themselves. And I missed the first part of your talk. You may have addressed it, but your Rochester reminiscence,
Mm-hmm.
by extension, may be your own about celluloid.
Sure.
And so I'd like to know, since you started pre-computer, at what point when the revelation of digital image came along, did you embrace it? Did you resent it? Tell us about that.
Sure. I've certainly struggled with it. I mean, if Kodachrome was still being produced, and the few publications that still hire photographers were willing to deal with film, I probably wouldn't work digitally at all. I mean, I have, sort of philosophically, I have real ambivalence of the intangibility of digital. I like to be able to touch the film, and I don't like that sense of looking at my desk and seeing 6 hard drives and the pictures are in there and I can't touch them. I also, particularly in the initial stages of digital, I wasn't crazy about the kind of quality that I could get from prints, that digital files seemed to produce prints that were very thin feeling. They were very sharp, very, sort of very correct, but they were almost sharper than life, whereas film has this sort of sense of depth and texture, a little bit like what people in the music business used to talk about between vinyl and CDs. Recently I've learned to do some things with my printer on the digital files, to give them a little bit more sense of depth. We add a little bit of grain and so forth, and the prints aren't exactly the same, but some of them are very beautiful. They have a slightly different quality. So, but I was very late I suppose I started working first fairly seriously digitally in 2009. And of course, for this Rochester project, I'm shooting some film, Kodachrome, but processing it as black and white as sort of a counterpart to the color digital that I'm working with.
Back to your process for a moment. A lot of your photographs have this sense that they can only ever be taken at that very moment, and that scene would never appear again, sort of in the history of the Earth. That appears to be something that is intentional. I'm curious what role that has in your work and in your process. Is it important to you to find a moment like that? How does that play into what
Well, I mean, for me, it's pretty mysterious. I don't know what's going to work as a photograph until it happens, and I may not even know right then. I may think maybe it happened, and then later on, I look at the image and say, "Oh yes," or often I say, "Oh no." I do believe that there are all these moments that are passing us by all the time, and we pay little attention to many of them. And one of the things that the camera does is that it doesn't see the way our eye does. It doesn't look we look at things and we always see, oh, there's a face. We look at that person, whereas the camera always sees the totality of the scene. And one of the things that's very exciting is that it will see all those different things simultaneously, and if you're attuned to that as a photographer, you begin to take kinds of pictures that surprise us in certain ways. These moments don't happen all the time, and to be honest, The Suffering of Light is the book is 120 pictures, and it was done over 30 years, so that's 4 pictures a year. And, behind that lie 8 books, so I've pulled, 5 to 10 pictures from each of the books and supplemented it with some other projects. So, there aren't a lot of moments in those 30 years. There's a significant editing process. So I don't know whether I answered your question, but anyway. Okay, someone back there? Yeah.
Back to the question about film, you said that on the Rochester project you're working with some film. I have 2 questions. Are you still working with film at all besides that, or is it digital? And then also, what equipment are you working with now, and what equipment you were primarily working with?
I'm now really pretty much working predominantly digital. I went through this thing when Kodachrome disappeared. Could I find another film that I really could embrace the way I embraced Kodachrome? But I also had some ambivalence about that because I am a working photographer, and some of my income comes from working for the few magazines that still hire photographers. The industry's changed a lot from what it was before, and I can't live off of just selling prints. So, and I really didn't like the notion of becoming kind of schizophrenic and sort of, carrying a film camera for myself and a digital camera for a magazine when I worked for someone, because a lot of the times I'm able to find pictures for myself even while I'm working for a publication. So I have pretty much embraced digital with some ambivalence still. As far as equipment, I used to use Leica rangefinders, and I still use Leica rangefinders. I use digital rangefinders. The digital Leicas have some issues. There's some problems with them, but the problems are so minor compared to what I would perceive the problems with a big single lens reflex. I like the smallness of the Leica, how unobtrusive it is. I feel that I can get into people's space in a way that I wouldn't, whether I could or not with a single lens reflex, I don't feel comfortable putting this big thing up in front of my eyes in people's faces. The little Leica, it's so unobtrusive, people don't take it seriously. Most people, except maybe New York City cops, don't realize that it's an incredibly valuable object. Anyway.
Yeah, I have a question because I think in the preface to The Suffering of Light, the book, you talk about how your experience on the street is sort of a bellwether for things that maybe are to come. Do you have a particular photograph that really illustrates that sense, whether you were in Haiti or Mexico?
That's an interesting question.
Or in, more recently?
I don't know. It's possible that the sort of tension of some of the first Haiti pictures may emotionally suggest what came later in terms of, there is whenever I've been in Haiti, there's been a kind of level of tension, but the level of tension in 86, even though it still felt sort of timeless, did seem to me to suggest the possibility of what happened in late 86 and 87 as the country went into violence. I just sort of feel like the sense of life on the street is as important to pay attention to really almost from a historical perspective as, what goes on in the halls of political power. And I think that you feel that particularly in a place like Haiti, where politics are so raw, where what happens on the street is so directly connected to what's happening in the halls of power. Whereas in a country like this or in Europe, there are all these buffers. Yeah.
So I mean, a lot of your images are very personal. You really, the observer looks at it, you feel like you're right in the middle of the scene. I know because I've tried to do a little history photography. That's a difficult thing because it's sort of obtrusive. You're sort of defining people a little bit. I guess my question has two parts. How do you engage with the person in a comfortable way so you don't make them feel like that they're being violated? And then also, do you compose a lot of your images? Do you direct them, or do you just sort of let them happen?
Okay. Well, I'll answer the second one. The second one's easier. I don't direct anyone. I mean, I let things, and for me, it would make sort of a mockery of what it is that excites me about photography, because one of the things that excites me about photographs is that, at least this kind of photograph, is that you can say it happened. Yes, it's just a sheet of paper or a transparency or something on a digital screen. And yes, the photographer stood a certain place and waited for a certain moment and pushed the shutter at a particular time. But nonetheless, you can say it happened. It is, on some level, a moment in history. You really can't say that about the other arts. You can't say that about a painting. Painting is simply the creation of the imagination of the painter. So that's an easy one to answer. Now, the first question was...
How do you go about not feeling...
Oh, right. Well, there are two things. First of all, I think that every photographer has to resolve something about the nature of the slightly aggressive act of photography. I mean, that you are always walking away with something, whether it's a piece of film or a digital representation. You are always taking something. And you have to sort of decide yourself what the parameters of that are. But even if it's of your family, you're and it's a picture of your wife or your kid or whatever, you're still taking something. Having said that, in terms of acts of aggression in our society, seems to me to be a pretty minor one, frankly. I mean, probably most times when we purchase something, someone's taking advantage of us more than, the act of photographing someone. But in terms of the actuality of being on the street, you feel it out. You feel out what feels comfortable. And when you're photographing, or when I'm photographing, there's a lot of non-visual communication. In other words, the first time I push the shutter, that really is a nonverbal question. The question is, can I take a picture? And if it seems okay, then I can push the shutter again. And that's another question. Can I take another picture? And another picture. So these are really sort of nonverbal questions. And as I said before, to follow up here, I think if you approach people with a certain level of seriousness, that you don't give an aura that you're making fun of them or taking advantage of them or so on, a lot of times people will let you into their space. And you may not even have to say anything. Sure, there are situations when I ask. I mean, a bunch of Ugandan soldiers standing around with their guns. I don't just run up to them and take a picture. I may have to get to know them. And so there are situations where I do hang out and wait and hope that something will sort of return to sort of more or less what it was when I first walked in there. But I try and intrude as little as I can, though I always know that on some level my presence does affect the situation.
I was wondering about, you have sort of journalistic photography and you have this other sort of lyrical side, and I was wondering how you view those. Are they in opposition? Do they mesh well together? Is there a line between them?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are, first of all, I mean, if we're talking about pure, really journalistic photography, meaning work that appears in journals, I do that to survive, you know. I mean, I work for various magazines, and I try and convince magazines to do what I want with the work as much as possible. But I always realize that magazines are driven by their own agenda. You know, they have advertisers they've got to appeal to, they've got subscribers they've got to appeal to. So, you know, if in a given project and there's 7 pictures in the magazine, if one of them is a picture that I really like that has another kind of level of ambiguity to it, then I feel like I've succeeded. But I always know that what magazines do isn't what I want. You know, I'm interested in photographs that ask questions, that have a certain level of ambiguity, that allow viewers really to find their own story within the picture, that isn't necessarily what I'm telling them. Whereas a lot of journalistic work, at its worst, serves simply as illustration, as text. But often, you know, a magazine wants a picture that says this quite clearly. I'm not interested in making clear statements. I think the world's a very, very complicated place, and I don't feel I'm the person to tell anyone how to view it. I can present something. I can present them a series of complications, a set of questions, and that's what I can do. As far as, you know, the work that I've shown here, I mean, there's work that certainly can fit within a journalistic context, but I don't really feel that's in opposition to more softer, more lyrical work. I mean, I see myself almost more like, you know, I mean, the analogy I would make to, you know, a novelist who has socio-political elements to the novel. It's still a novel, it's still fictional, it may be lyrical, but at the same time, there are elements that have some kind of socio-political potency to them. So that's so, you know, I don't feel they're in opposition. If I go to Haiti and I take a picture of some kids playing that's lyrical, I don't feel that's in opposition to turning around and finding something that's much more disturbing that could potentially be interpreted as highly socio-political. For me, it's part of a continuum. What I think is different is when magazines use certain pictures of mine in certain ways, or I have to take certain kinds of pictures that are less complicated and less questioning. I mean, being a professional photographer and working this way, there is a kind of schizophrenia, and one has to be very tough on oneself as to which are the pictures that are really your pictures and which are the pictures that you have done to, you know, keep an editor to solve an editor's problems. Okay.